Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the 28th Cree lecture. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Barbara Oakley, who is a distinguished professor of engineering at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Her work focuses on the complex relationship between neuroscience and social behavior. She created and teaches Coursera Learning How to Learn, and one of the world's most popular massive open online course with over 3 million registered students, along with other popular top online courses of all time. Barbara is a New York Times bestselling author who has published in outlets as varied as Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Her book, A Mind for Numbers, has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. She is the winner of the McGraw Prize, the Colloquial Nobel Prize for Education, and is a fellow of both the Institute for Electronics and Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE, and American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. With that, I will hand over the mic to Barbara. Thank you very much, and it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you again, Sue, for the invitation to share. And I'll go ahead and dive right in. Now, one thing I'd like to say is I'm from Oakland University, and most people, when they think of Oakland, they think, oh, it's that city in California. So you've got nice palm trees, everything's good. But actually, the reality is that I am from Oakland University in Michigan. And this is me going to work on a typical February day. And as Sue mentioned, I co-teach the course, Learning How to Learn on Coursera. And my instructor is Terry Sinowski, the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute. And this is Terry on a typical February day near the Salk Institute. So that's one of the great things about online teaching, is that not only can students get together from very different parts of the world, but actually professors can also get together from very different backgrounds. So the, the the thing is that I was shocked when I was invited to speak at Harvard. I was a bit of a nervous wreck because it's Harvard. And I walked into the room and I was even more nervous because it was packed, standing room only. And I thought, why are there so many people here? It turned out that our one little course, made for less than $5,000, mostly in my basement, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses put together, made for millions of dollars and with hundreds of people. So what this tells you, I think, is something very important, that people in general are starved for good information based on solid research on how we learn effectively. And they are really intensely interested in how the brain works to help inform why we do what we do when we're learning. So one thing I really want to stress is that the World Economic Forum has, in the past, like 2015, they always put out these top 10 skills every 5 years that they project are going to be needed. In 2015, nothing about learning was talked about. Likewise for 2020. But when a representative from the World Economic Forum went to UCSD and saw what was going on with with learning how to learn, suddenly now in the top 10 skills of 2025, guess what? Learning about learning is now deemed highly important. And particularly with what's going on with ChatGPT and generative AI, we are having to learn at a faster rate than ever before. So learning about learning is a critical um, thing to be doing nowadays. Now, let's dive right in and see what is going on when we are learning. If you look at the brain, it's enormously complicated, of course. It's one of the fundamental building blocks, however, is the neuron. And of course, we know there's about 86 billion of them in the brain. Now, you may think, okay, this is where I'm going to dive into the sort of boring scientific stuff. So let's spice up our explanation of a neuron. If you look, here, let's see, we've got a metaphor for a neuron. And our metaphor for a neuron is that of a space alien. And just to get you acquainted with neurons a bit more easily, we'll just think about this space alien. It's got 3 legs, and those are analogous to dendrites. Of course, real neurons can have many more than just 3 dendrites. They can have dozens or even hundreds. This space alien has like little toes on it, and those are analogous to dendritic spines. And lastly, it's got like an arm that reaches upward, and that's analogous to an axon. And what neurons like to do is, in essence, kind of reach out and tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. What it's really doing, of course, is it's sending out a signal. And that signal travels along, it's mostly electrical, jumps that gap with neurotransmitters, and goes on to the next neuron. And what this is, what's going on is, in essence, whenever you are learning something, you are sending signals and connecting together a clump of neurons in long-term memory in the neocortex. Well, at least you hope it's in long-term memory, but you're creating these clumps of connected neurons. Whether you're learning how to take a derivative in math, or how to do a dance step, or how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language, whatever you're learning, you're simply making connections between neurons in the neocortex in long-term memory. So how can we strengthen those connections? Well, practice helps us strengthen those connections. And one thing I should point out that I think is very important is that for a number of years now, top educators and top psychologists have said, oh, you don't need to remember things. You can always just look it up. But would I be able to speak Spanish, for example, if I always just use Google Translate? It is vitally important for us to actually have those links, that structure in our long-term memory, if we are to become an expert at anything. So as we're practicing, we're creating and strengthening those links. But the converse of this is, when we don't practice, well, actually, if we sort of leave it be and just let things go and maybe don't look at what we're learning for a couple of weeks, well, our little synaptic janitors can just sweep those links away. So this, in part, is why it's so important to space out and repeat over time. Now, as we're learning and we're practicing, we're strengthening those links, and it becomes like a nice, thick set of links that we can easily draw to mind whenever we might need it. But this brings me to a very important aspect of that relates to learning, and that is the value of metaphor. We so, for example, I wrote a book about learning called The Mind for Numbers, and I received input from thousands of professors related, top teaching professors related to how they teach effectively. And when I was corresponding with these individuals, I was very surprised. I found that um, some of these top teachers had a little um, technique that they used to help them become top teachers and to help them stay as top teachers. And what was that little technique? It was, as they told me, time after time, individual after individual, that they used metaphor. And they often didn't tell the other teachers that this was an important trick that they used. Why didn't they tell other teachers? Because the other teachers would make fun of them and say, well, there's a reason why you're so popular as a teacher. It's that you make things so easy for students. But isn't that our goal as teachers, to try to make the material a little bit more graspable and easier for our students to understand? Now, why would metaphor be so important? If you look, let's say that you are teaching about, um, you have new students and you're trying to teach them about electrical current flow. Well, everyone has a concept already in their brain related to the flow of water. And if you remind them of how water flows, they can then much more easily kind of bridge into the new idea of how electrical current flows. So, so if you know some analogous concept already, often it can be used to help students much more easily bridge into those new concepts. So, of course, you might say, but yeah, water is kind of workable as a metaphor for electrical current flow, but at a quantum level, it breaks down. The thing is, when you do have a good metaphor, well, like like water for electrical current flow, inevitably that metaphor is just a metaphor, and that means it's going to break down at certain places and in certain ways of thinking about things. But whenever a metaphor breaks down, all you have to do is just throw it away and get a new metaphor. So it's nothing that difficult to do. Well, unless you're thinking about quantum, good luck coming up with a quantum metaphor for the flow of electricity, but good luck with quantum on anything. Now, how do you come up with metaphors? Simple. Generative AI. It's the best technique that we really have available. So let's say that you are trying to teach Python programming and you want to talk about the difference between main guard and scope. Well, ask ChatGPT what it recommends as far as a good metaphor, and what it'll tell you, and it'll even come up with an image that you should think of, or you can think of Python, the main guard, as being like the gatekeeper of a castle, and scope is like the various rooms within that castle. And it'll give you a lot more information besides. Now, the interesting thing is, come up with this metaphor. That's interesting. And it's actually quite helpful for students. But if you don't like this metaphor, just ask it, and it will come up with a different and a different and a different metaphor. So metaphors can have places of good fit and poor fit. And, different metaphors can have more places of good fit. It can have, you can have many places of good fit or just a few places of good fit of any particular metaphor. So just ask away and you'll be very interested to see all the different kinds of metaphors that it can bring forth for you. I like to think of metaphors as being more or less a good fit in various high dimensional places. So if we're talking about ChatGPT or generative AI in particular, of course, the heart of that is the transformer. And many of us know the transformer was first laid out in the paper Attention is All You Need from 2017. Interestingly, the Google engineers who devised this paper and the technique of this transformer that was described in this paper, they Google itself just said, this transformer idea, nah, not going to do it. And so they went off and began working for Anthropic and many of the different other companies. And of course, the result is that we have generative AI. So, of course, what a transformer does is it takes in whatever our prompt is into the encoder, comes out with its output through the decoder. And this is not a class in how transformers work. What I just want you to notice is that the flow of information through transformers in AI is uncannily similar to the flow of information in the human brain. And that should be no surprise because AI has arisen because it was informed by neuroscience. And of course, neuroscience in turn is being informed by AI. So learning has, it's like baking a cake. It has many different aspects to it. And so I want to turn to a completely different aspect, and that is the different modes of thinking that the brain can normally fall into. We can, of course, focus, and that focused mode is like when you're paying close attention to something. Diffuse mode is more like when you're mind wandering or daydreaming. Diffuse mode is, it's called by neuroscientists the default mode network. Psychologists call it the task negative network, where psychologists call the focus mode the task positive network. But to better understand these two different modes, we are going to use, let me see, what are we going to use to better explain this? Do you want to put an idea into the chat? If you would. Go ahead and just type your thought about some technique I'm going to use.
Repeat your question again, please.
If you would type it into chat, what technique could I use to better explain focused versus diffuse modes? So what teaching technique could I use? Hint, we've talked about it.
Yeah, I'm looking for a metaphor. I was thinking.
There we go. That was exactly it.
Focusing a camera on a very particular object versus a larger panoramic view. To me, panoramic view is much more diffused than taking a photograph of a particular object in a particular spot. I see that
Yes.
as focused and diffused mode. Maybe it's not a metaphor which will work, but it seems to work at the start of it.
And that was what I was kind of hinting at, was what technique would I use to better explain these? And you perfectly encapsulated it. I would use a metaphor to basically better explain these ideas. And um, sort of focusing of a lens is a really good metaphor for focused versus diffuse. Now, I'm going to use a slightly different metaphor. And again, that's the power of metaphors, is different metaphors can highlight different ideas, but they all kind of can bring something to the surface. And the metaphor I'd like to use is, oh, look, arrow as a metaphor for focus mode. Oh, I love that. That's actually quite good, because it's like to the point, and you're focusing precisely on something. And that's a very good metaphor. So what I'd like to use as a metaphor, another metaphor, just to help kind of bring out some of these ideas a little bit more from a neuroscientific perspective, is to use the metaphor of a pinball machine.
Mm.
So if you think about it, I mean, let's just remember what a pinball machine is and how it works. You pull back on that plunger and a ball goes bouncing around, and that's how you get points. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine and we're going to put it right onto the human brain. Good evening, Dingala, Rajendra. It's welcome aboard. So I'm looking at the chat here. So let's look. Oops, we're going to look at how that metaphor of the pinball looks like when we put it on the human brain. And if you think about it, it's kind of like we've got these rubber bumpers. They're very close together, and that's signifying that it's a metaphor or an analogy for the focused mode of thinking. And in this mode, you you often have sort of connections that have already been made by virtue of the fact that you've already learned something. And you can use that in your thinking. So let's say that I asked you to multiply 23 times 47. Well, if I asked you to do that, what would happen is let's see if I can get this to work properly. There we go. Your thoughts would move right along the pathway that had already been laid, because you already know how to multiply. So you might have solved the problem. You know, a few of us can do those kind of numbers in our head. Others can do it algorithmically by laying it out on paper. But however you solve it, you're solving it because you already have laid those links. You've learned about multiplication and how to do it. But what if you are learning something completely new? So let's say that you are uh, like, let's just take a simple example. Let's say you already know how to multiply, but you have never done division before. You know, you're 8 years old. So your teacher explains it in class that day. And you go home, you start working on a problem. And what can happen as you're trying to solve your first division problem is that you are basically, see, you're trying to lay these links in a new location, but your thoughts can keep slithering back up to your old multiplication knowledge, because you're familiar with those ideas, and you're comfortable. But of course, you can't solve this new problem. So you can find yourself getting more and more and more frustrated, and you end up, just shutting the book and walking away. Or if you're an adult and you're trying to figure out some new configuration in the work you're doing, you get frustrated, you walk away. And when you get your attention off of that particular um, problem that you're trying to solve or concept you're trying to understand, what happens is it opens up that very different set of or mode of thinking, and it's the diffuse mode. So in this mode, your thoughts can range much more broadly. They can't kind of think in a careful, focused way that you can when you're in the focused mode, but you can at least get to the new place you want to be in order to solve that problem or figure out that concept. Learning, we've often thought, oh, it only takes place when we're focusing. But the reality is, we also need that sort of downtime where our mind can be working in the background. So learning involves going back and forth between focused and diffuse modes. You cannot be in both modes at the same time unless you're, taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I am not advocating that here. So normally what I do is I like to have a little breakout session and we think about these things. But what I'd like you to do for just 30 seconds here is I want you to stop and think and see if you can come up with a metaphor that's different than mine and perhaps different than the lenses of focusing and diffusing that Soup had suggested, and just see if you can type a a metaphor for focused versus diffuse in the meeting chat. Let's take about 30 seconds and kind of see what we can see here, the ideas. Nice.
I just want to mention I have two of my colleagues from KTH sitting with me and listening to your lecture, and this metaphor came from one of them.
Okay, I like that. That's iron filings with or without a magnet. Ooh, that is really, I've never heard that one before, and that's a really interesting one. And never heard ant colonies. That's a good one.
It's actually ant searching for food, and then once they find it, they focus on it, and everybody follows the line to get the food. So,
Ah,
as a social diffusion and social focus, so
I
society.
love it. I know very little about ants, and so but I've seen them do this kind of thing, and it is actually a fantastic analogy because also when you're focusing, you're making those connections between neurons, and it's a little bit of that line that we saw before, although actually it could be sort of a clump of related neurons. One thing I should bring out is that that clump of related neurons about a task, technique, concept that you've learned can also very much overlap with the neurons aren't just like specifically devoted only to that particular concept or thing that you're learning. So one neuron can actually be revealing or touching or a part of many different overlapping concepts. So it's quite interesting. So this what we just did there was, oh, people in a crowd in public place versus people when um uh, they're around a famous personality. Oh, that is, yeah, because everyone focuses on the famous personality, and yet when they're just in a crowd, they're randomly wandering. So that's an excellent metaphor. Uh, so so what we just have done right here is we took a tiny little diffuse mode break, because when you stop and you're actually kind of retrieving ideas from your own mind, that is a part of that's diffuse mode thinking. And so having a little bit of a break in your classes where you're having your students actively learn or actively think about things, or if they might be talking with one another, it's not only them talking with one another or you thinking about a specific idea. It's the fact that for a few seconds, you tune out focus on me or what I'm teaching. And that allows your brain to kind of have this little bit of a break, a neural break. If you even if try just blinking your eyes, just blink for a minute, like a second, that second when your eyes are closed, you're momentarily going into that diffuse mode. So you may say, well, how long a break do I need to give my students? Certainly it doesn't need to be very long. Uh, it's a little bit tough for students to come up with or really grapple with a new idea in or relax their brain in only a second. But even 15 seconds or a minute or two where you ask students to interact with one another or to think about an idea can be adequate to give them that little bit of diffuse mode break. So now I have another question for you. So what is the way you use most often to help with your learning? I'm going to give you 4 techniques and think about which one you think is the most effective. Is it rereading, highlighting or underlining, or retrieval practice, or recall, that is like using a flashcard or something? Or could it be creating a concept map? So hopefully you've got in mind which one you think is the best. And let's see, I have to keep you in suspense here for a moment. Oftentimes people will say concept mapping. And the problem is the concept map people they're really good at PR. Here's the reality. Uh, the 4th one, yes, concept map, but that's incorrect. And in fact, one interesting fact for you is that replication is, of course, a big problem in science. Replication, yeah, of course, just means having someone else um, do the experiment or the research that you conducted to see if you have um, the same result. Replication is a huge problem in education. In fact, as it turns out, only 0.13% of educational research literature studies are replicated. That means as long as you can get something published, you're golden, because it's very unlikely that anyone will go and check. And oftentimes people will publish on things that they truly believe are actually the best thing since sliced cheese, or the best thing to help students. But just because they believe it doesn't make it true. And this is part of why we have these fads in education, where people will, we'll try concept maps, or we'll try something else. And it's because it's not thoroughly vetted with hundreds of research papers. And in fact, the most powerful way to learn effectively, bar none, is retrieval practice. And why is that? Because when students are first learning, like when I'm explaining something to you now, you are, people will say, oh, a teacher's explanation doesn't get anything into your students. Au contraire. What it does is it lays very weak links. So those links they're quite weak to start with. Let's see, let me get this going here. So see, there's initial learning. Right now, you are learning a little bit of information, but each time you retrieve those links from your own mind, you are actually strengthening those links. Now, the people will often say, oh yeah, well, that's for trivial facts, like you're learning your multiplication tables, or you're learning the fact of the date of the French Revolution or something. But it isn't just for trivial facts. In fact, if it depends on the retrieval practice questions you're asking. If you ask for trivial facts, yeah, it'll be very simplistic learning. But if you ask for much more complex facts or insights, like can you visualize the matrix that this particular theorem is describing? Can you visualize it in your brain? In fact, Michael Nielsen, the physicist, used retrieval practice to help him as he was thinking about a theorem to devise a new way of proving that theorem. So it depends on what kind of retrieval you're doing. If you're thinking about things as you're walking and thinking about, kind of the complexity and the relationships and all sorts of aspects of what you're learning, retrieval practice can help you learn at a very high Bloom's taxonomy level. So retrieval practice is really important. And I would like to point out that many of my colleagues, for example, at Oakland University, are from countries that their original education was in countries that still valued retrieval practice. So it's not necessarily a bad thing at all, and it is far, far better than concept mapping, as shown by Jeff Karpicki's paper it was in Science in 2012, and as shown as well by hundreds and hundreds of other papers. In fact, even when they compare retrieval practice done of concept maps, so you're trying to retrieve the concept map, actually retrieval practice alone is far better than retrieval practice with concept maps. So how is retrieval practice different from memorization learning? Let's give an example. Let's say that you learn how to solve a how to solve a problem. Well, you can memorize every step for solving the problem. And you don't really understand what the meaning is. But the essential idea of retrieval practice is that you are like you see the problem, and then you might see if you can work it out step by step on paper from your own mind, and do every step in that problem from your own mind, as opposed and so you're trying to see if you can kind of retrieve each step of what you need to do to solve that problem. You're not just, okay, yeah, here I'm mindlessly memorizing that I do this and I do this. You're actually kind of thinking about what is the next step and letting that next step whisper to you. In some sense, retrieval practice can be the same as memorization, but it's often meant, it's intended to be that you kind of get the sense, the meaning of what you're retrieving. You're thinking about it very deeply. And indeed, retrieval practice happens, it's a diffuse mode activity. You're not like looking at the paper, you're retrieving the concept from your own mind. So I'm hoping that that might give you a little bit better sense. There's a very good book by Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bain called Powerful Teaching that gives a lot of ideas for retrieval practice and how to do it in the classroom. And I can send you a list of hundreds of papers about retrieval practice. But just keep in mind, it's not just simple memorization. It's trying to internalize and be able to fluently retrieve whatever information and kind of put together the ideas that you have learned. So one thing, so one of my favorite retrieval practice apps is called I Do Recall. And I do recall you can like input a whatever flashcard, so to speak, that you want to. You could grade yourself on how well you do. You can upload PDFs, create retrieval practice questions from the PDFs, and ask yourself so things like, what was the key idea of this paper? Those kinds of questions, and be able to retrieve, and which parts of the brain perhaps link into one another. You're thinking about sort of these sort of in-depth retrieval questions to help you remember the key concepts within that paper. So another thing that I like about this particular app is, if you look right up here, see where it says groups, you can see that you can create content, or you can create a group that can allow your class to make flashcards that they can share and help one another learn. Now, this particular app was created by a medical doctor who used retrieval practice with flashcards, much like these, to graduate #1 in his class at a very distinguished medical school. And the thing is, he didn't really go to class. He watched videos, he read books, and rather than taking notes, he used retrieval practice flashcards that asked very deep conceptual questions as well as simpler questions, because sometimes you just have to have that knowledge within you. Of course, you can use many different apps. Quizlet, Kahoot are also very popular. They're rather simple. Anki, on the other hand, is sort of the grandfather of all retrieval practice apps. But it is a bit hard to learn just because it can do so much. But all of these are worth checking out. And then I also there's something called Pear Deck and Nearpod. So if you're teaching online, you can use these apps to send retrieval practice questions to your entire class, and get so everybody's getting a retrieval question, and then you can even share anonymously the answers. But what one thing we often do is we go into a class and we say at the beginning of class, well, last week what we covered was, and then we go over what we covered. But we shouldn't be doing this. We should be asking our students as we walk into a class, what are the key concepts you remember from what we covered in the last class? It makes your students work harder. It makes them think harder, but it also helps them to learn much better. So notice when I say, what were the key concepts? It's not like some simplistic um, necessarily formula that you just, oh, I'll write a couple things down. It's like, what were the key ideas being covered? And that can help really kind of integrate key ideas into your students' brains. So I do want to mention what's going on. I say Chat GPT, but it can be any generative AI program you can upload documents into. You probably are aware of this, but you simply tuck your paper in and then upload it. And what you can do once you've uploaded the paper is whatever that electronic um, uh, document is, perhaps related to something you're teaching, you can ask for retrieval practice questions related to it. Another thing that might help you in your teaching relates to asking pre-testing questions. And what this means is, for example, when you first begin a chapter or teaching about a chapter, let's say you're teaching about different distributions in probability theory, you can generate a set of questions before you even teach anything and give your students a little test which they will flunk because unless they've already taken some of the material. And you might ask yourself, well, why would I give a test that I know my students will flunk? It's because of this. Students often don't know what's important to be learning. And if you give them a pretest, even though they know nothing about the material, trying to answer those questions will kind of prompt their mind to teach them or to give them a sense of what is important in what they're about to study. And so this pretest has been shown to be valuable in helping students learn better because they have a little bit of like a lattice or a set of hangers that they can start putting ideas onto. They have a sense of what's more important. Also, you can, of course, ask, like for me, I might be um, trying to review, let's say, 7 research papers in a day to get the key ideas. I mean, we're all flooded with information. So it's if I upload, ask for key ideas, that can help us to like get a little synopsis that's better than just the abstract. What I like to use is something called a text expander. The one I use is Abbreviate, but there's many different expanders. And what this does is, in essence, look at this .c. Whenever I type .c, it automatically generates, it expands that simple set of symbols that I've typed into a full sentence. And so the sentence is, can you provide a 3-page synopsis in layperson's terms of the attached document? And often, I don't know, generative AI can't count very well, so it never really gives you 3 pages, but it'll give you a nice set of synapses of sort of, it's better than an abstract at getting you the key ideas, and then you can quickly get those key ideas and decide whether that paper is worth delving more deeply into. Now, just keep in mind that there's 3 leading platforms at present, ChatGPT, Claude 3, and Gemini. And there's lots of, others, Perplexity and so forth. Right now, my favorite is Claude 3. So it is better at, like if you ask ChatGPT to give you the key ideas, it will summarize, but not give key ideas. Claude 3, on the other hand, is able to give the real key ideas. So I like it better, but I argue more with it. So I'm not sure if that's good or bad. But each, and of course they make mistakes. Just today I was uploading a paper, and I asked it to give me a sort of the essence of the paper, and it said, well, you didn't upload the paper. And I said, yes, I did, it's right here. And it's like, oh yeah, that's right, you did. So but we all know that summarizing and giving key ideas, these generative AI platforms are very good at, but of course they can kind of miss out on lots of things, giving incorrect information on specific references. Each generative AI platform has its own individual characteristics. It's a good idea not to get too used to one of them. Try them all, spend a little time, and you'll get more of a feel of what they're really like. Now, I want to bring out the value of sort of engaging your students. So good hooks are really important. And these hooks, to get your students curious, what they can do is they elicit that dopamine, the feel-good molecule, or more like the anticipatory molecule. Dopamine, it is put forth as a result of unexpected surprises. So the dopamine system, of course, it goes throughout the brain, and it can, in particular, sort of send dopamine to areas of the brain that are involved in whatever we're really trying to figure out or learn about. Interestingly, little mice that have their dopamine systems inactivated can't actually learn something new. So dopamine is really an important part of learning. And I'll try to give you just a bit of a sense of why that is. If we're trying to solve a problem, for example, and we're curious about that problem, we try, no solution. So we try yet another approach, no solution. So we try yet again with another approach, doesn't work. So we keep trying, and eventually, well, we can find the solution. And once we get that aha, that pleasant surprise of, oh, I got it right, it actually sprinkles dopamine along that pathway of learning, and that is what sort of solidifies those links of learning that I was talking about earlier. So dopamine is a powerful tool to help us with our learning. And hooking your students, getting them a little curious, really help enhance that link making that's at the heart of learning. Now, also, if your students are curious, research has shown that it helps them focus. In fact, their visual field will sharpen around what they're focusing on and kind of dim out in other places. And interestingly, it when students are curious, it actually suppresses that diffuse mode network. So mind wandering goes away, they become really focused. And when we're teaching, we really like that. So what does this
Barbara,
mean
if
for
I
us
may just
practically?
Barbara, if I may just interrupt. Usually the lecture quote
Yes.
1 hour, but I'll extend it by 15 minutes so that our audience knows. Uh, it'll be for another 15 minutes so that we can
Oh, okay.
continue
Uh,
given the lovely lecture you are
my
giving us.
goodness.
It's
I-
okay. It's okay. It's
Okay.
important that people learn about these things. So I'm going to give you the privilege of using the time as much as you want.
Oh, okay. Well, we're getting close to being done. So thank goodness. I think we started a little late, and but I
Yes, yes,
should have had
please.
my
Yeah.
eye on the time a little better. So anyway, we should use Gen AI to help give us ideas to provoke curiosity. So, for example, I was recently last week I was in Mongolia, and one of the problems for Mongolian teachers is that when they are trying to teach about things, for example, like Python programming, how can they um, connect with their students who are often coming off of nomadic ways of life? So, how can you teach about Python programming in with regards to students who are of very different backgrounds? It's simple. You just ask ChatGPT, and you can see here it reveals all sorts of interesting ideas, comparing, you know, yurts, for example, to scope and herding to main guard. So it's quite an interesting way of teaching. And so just a last little tidbit, it relates to working memory, long-term memory, and the process. So if you look, uh, this working memory, we can hold about four things in mind. And so for pieces of information, that's sort of temporarily what we can hold consciously in mind. Long-term memory is more like a set of lockers scattered throughout the brain, and that is, of course, where we store those sets of links. So as we're learning, we're creating those sets of links with our working memory, and then we are storing those sets of links. And later, when we need those sets of links, we can easily pull them to mind. So this brings me to our younger daughter, Rachel, she is modeling what it felt like for her when she was first learning how to back up a car. So if you look, she's looking in the mirror, she's looking back, she's looking forward. How does she do this? And of course, off she goes into the ditch. But what was really happening was when she was first learning to back up the car, her working memory had a heavy cognitive load, and she didn't have any sort of arms available in her attentional octopus for anything else. Once she learned how to back up a car, it's all easy. She just can pull to mind, I want to back up a car. She has a light cognitive load. She can connect, she can even think about other things while she's backing up that car. So what we want our students to be doing, of course, is coming sitting down to our tests, and we have a little bit of creativity, but they practice with retrieval practice, made those, and then they could easily kind of pull things to mind and work whatever problems or relate the concepts that we want them to be understanding and working. But if they haven't used retrieval practice, they can often fool themselves into thinking that something is a long-term memory when it actually is not. And they can come to you and say, I knew the material better than the test showed, but they often don't know the material better. It's just they've fooled themselves that they have learned effectively. So learning again is just you're creating those nice sets of links, you're putting them in the closet of long-term memory. You practice by retrieving, of course, and each retrieval helps build those sets of links. So you're retrieving from long-term memory. But what's important, particularly in this day and age of generative AI, is that if we want our students to be able to think critically about what they're learning, they have to have those links in long-term memory. A lot of times, if something is wrong in generative AI, you won't know it if you have nothing to compare it to look at that's in your long-term memory that tells you, wait, this does not make sense. So as students are learning, just keep in mind, they only have 4 arms of working memory, but generative AI has thousands of arms. And that's why we want to be careful with prompting to kind of tell generative AI what's important as it's reaching into its own memory. And we, of course, are living now at the age of a new revolution in education and in learning. So I am really grateful to be able to share, and I'm so sorry to be going on a bit too long, and I'm done. So thank you so much.
Thank you for a really wonderful lecture. And I think going over time is not an issue, except that it's dinner time in India, I think. But that's okay. I wanted to ask you a question. My colleagues here also, I think, have a couple of questions, and I'm sure many people have questions and they may want to put it on the chat. Uh, when I said concept map, it's interesting that I didn't connect concept map to retrieval. I'll tell you an example, given that I'm in Sweden. I used to work with an engineer from Sweden. He used to design transformers. And he said when a new engineer came in, he would make them draw the concept map because a transformer, electrical power transformer, has over 600 parameters. And once they draw the concept map, every time they actually solve the problem, design, he asked them to go back and look at the concept map to see which paths were valid paths for the design of that transformer. So it was, and you mentioned this, that it is even with concept map, you do require retrieval to reinforce the concept map. And really, that really struck me as a practicing engineer telling me how he taught his junior engineers to understand the entire design of transformers, but he made them do the concept map first to have it on the side so that they can retrieve the right causal structure for each one of those transformers they design. So thank you for that
So
example.
I'm curious, was it a concept map or was it an actual diagram of a transformer with the connections that the transformer could be making?
You see, generally, an engineer sort of knows a transformer is quite complicated because you've got electrical, mechanical, thermal issues. So unless you
Mhm.
have some kind of a concept map in terms of the relationship of the different parameters, you can very easily miss the interconnections. It's not just one thing, it's multiple domains
Mhm.
coming into play. And they, of course, don't see a transformer. They've seen transformers and how it is, how it looks like, and what are the pieces of it. But at the same time, they needed to have a concept map as a way to actually reinforce their understanding
Mhm.
of how to do design. This is something I interrogated him for quite a bit of time, and why he
Mhm.
uses, because we were building a support system for designing transformers, and he told us, please build a concept map along with the tools, so that as they
Right.
do, so they can go back and refer to the concept map as to how they understood the particular design of the transformer, because there are variations
That's
depending,
fascinating.
the
Yes.
variations in a transformer in Florida, which is hot, versus a transformer in Oakland, Michigan, which is cold, right? You have different
Right.
parameters interacting in different ways. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, I thought I will mention this example to you from someone who understood what you are talking about from practice and developed his own pedagogical method very close to what you're talking.
I like that, and I think it's an informative twist that's really powerful, showing how there is a way that concept maps can be used as a very good tool.
Mhm. Thank you. I think there are some questions in the
Oh, can I share the concept? You know
yeah.
what? I can do even better than that. Let me share my slides with you.
Oh, sure.
Um, and um,
I'll
that way you
distribute.
can
I'll
go
distribute.
in. Yes. So let me just get them. I can send the let's see,
You
where's
can
my
send it to my email, or put it in some Dropbox, which I can pick it up and distribute later on to those who want it. Uh,
okay.
yeah.
Let's see, where is oh, where did my oh, there it is. Okay.
There is a question in the chat. How does experiential learning affect retrieval? I thought,
Um, experiential learning is okay. Here's the
okay.
so there's the link, and so you can download the PowerPoint. Please feel free to use it. If you think about it, well, okay, let's not just think about it. I want to give you I'm going to show another set of visuals because experiential learning is really um, so important and such an important part of learning. So if you can um, bear with me, I will just take like 2 minutes and try to do justice to this wonderful question. Um, okay, so let me see here. Okay, so I am going to be getting, so hopefully you see Julius Ego here.
Yeah.
Okay, so he is from Kenya. He always wanted to become a person who threw the javelin. Not he didn't, like most Kenyans, he didn't want to be a long distance runner. So what he did was he actually started watching YouTube videos, and then he would go out and practice. He would get that experiential learning. So in this way, he actually became the world champion in um, in throwing the javelin. So what he was doing was we've always thought lecture was really the best way to learn until they kind of figured out active learning is really powerful. But now people understand just active learning alone is not really enough. You do need to mix in some bit of lecture with active learning. And whether it's a lot of lecture and a little active learning, or a lot of active learning and a little lecture, it's some mixture of this lecture with active learning seems to be what is actually most powerfully effective to help students learn. This mixture of active learning, experiential learning with lecture is called direct instruction. And if you look, what Julius was doing was he was watching videos, that's the lecture, then he was actually going out and throwing that spear. That's the experiential active learning. And we can actually look in the brain and see what's going on with these. And this is a little bit oversimplified, but it's just to get the basic ideas here. So I had mentioned that we create sets of links when we're learning, but I didn't mention that there's two pathways to create those sets of links. There is one pathway that takes information from working memory into long-term memory through the hippocampus. The other takes information and goes through the basal ganglia. That's that procedural or the experiential pathway and way of learning. And both pathways are really important in learning. So that experiential way of learning, if you want to kind of know some of the differences, I'll just list them really quickly. But in essence, I should say that procedural learning is something that you're often not conscious of. You're experiencing it. You can't explain it very well. It can involve very complex patterns. Surprisingly, you learn your native language through that basal ganglia procedural learning pathway. And so that's why you often can't explain why you do something in your native language, where someone who learned that language as an adult through their declarative system can do the explanations. They can explain why you might form a past tense the way you did. And of course, procedural learning develops through practice. It's that experience. So it's how can we teach these two different types of learning? Retrieval practice helps with both types. And spaced repetition, I didn't really talk about that, but it just means doing over a number of days. Explanation helps with declarative, but procedural learning, how can we help students with that? Through a process called interleaving. And we normally teach ideas, or like you don't want to teach a physical skill just by having them necessarily doing it over and over and over and over again. You want to, like you do want to, but you want to mix it up with other things. So like in sports, you practice like a certain type of throw by interleaving it with other types of activities you might do in that sport. If you're learning statistics, you don't want to just give your students a bunch of geometric distribution and negative binomial and binomial distribution individually. You want to, once they get the key idea, they've practiced a couple times, mix up those problems. And that way, I mean, what happens on a final test is you mix up problems. And if you haven't mixed up problems before in what students are learning, they can really have trouble when you're taking the final. So even in your homework assignments, mix up different, especially closely related concepts that can be easily mixed up. I like to kind of say it's a little like you're learning how to use a tool. And if you get too used to one tool, like one mental approach, one tactic, you can think that everything should be done in that way. And that's why students often you give them one way of doing a problem, say geometric distribution, and they can not realize if you haven't given them practice that no, this might need the binomial distribution to solve this problem. So mixing up, especially easily mixed up ideas or concepts or approaches. It's like with flashcards. If you have birds that are similar, you want to interleave different kinds of birds. You don't want to interleave like the study of birds with grammatical structures, because that's like sort of um, mixing something that's pretty obviously quite different, and it's not going to be very helpful. So I'm sure you're sorry now that you asked that question.
Not at all. I think Sudhir, who asked the question, has been trying to incorporate experiential learning in a big way in his institution. And I think he's very happy that we got a long but interesting answer. And really, thank you so much. And I'm contemplating whether we should invite you for an open session of this lecture later on, where many people can actually interrogate you, ask you different questions as a sort of a forum. And I'll find out how the interest is, and we will go from there. And I also learned from you that you're going to India, and I'll talk to you about it later as to how you can meet some of the people who have been helpful in setting up the series of lectures uh, which I've had. This is the 28th lecture, and I hope to get people from different parts of the world talking about engineering education and other educational issues. So, with that, I want to thank you very much, and you have a wonderful time in Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure
Okay.
it's not as cold as it is in Stockholm, even though spring started yesterday. And thank you so much. And I'll
Oh,
be in
you're
touch.
very welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.